you. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker, our speaker on the theme of cultural competency, Miss Rozella Haydee White. She is the Love Big Coach, a public theologian, spiritual life coach, leadership consultant, inspirational speaker, and writer focused on nurturing love that is life giving, justice seeking, and sustaining. Rozella is the owner of RHW Consulting, LLC, an agency focused on accompanying clients as they align their being, beliefs, and behaviors in order to deconstruct and dismantle systems, structures, and social constructs that inhibit justice and liberation. Our Synod has already had the benefit of learning from her during our Imago Day series, and we are glad to welcome her back today for both a presentation and a lunch workshop. For those of you who know me well, and those of you who are with us and are just getting to know us, Rozella is a very, very good friend. She's a soul sister. And so I'm really, really grateful for her friendship, but more importantly, I'm really grateful for her wisdom. And so I'm looking forward to what we may learn from her this morning still. Thank you, Rozella, for being with us.
Hello, and good afternoon, good morning. It still is morning. I am based in Houston, Texas, and so it's Central Standard Time here. But first and foremost, thank you, Bishop Ortiz, and members of the Synod staff, leadership, and Synod Assembly Planning Committee for inviting me to join you for your Synod Assembly today. I'm excited to be with you all to explore the conversation or the theme of cultural competency. And what I'd like to begin with, right, is to do some problematizing, if you will, right, to explore exactly what the words are that this phrase is made up of, right? Culture and competency. So I want you for a moment to just think about these two words, right? To think about culture, to think about what comes to mind, to notice what comes up in you as you reflect on this term. Now, I have to situate myself a little bit, right? So I am Afro-Puerto Rican, I'm Black Puerto Rican, so Black Latina, and my mother's side is from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico and Jamaica and Panama. My father's side are descendants of those who were part of the Atlantic slave trade, right? And so those are pieces of my culture. I'm also a woman who is 39 years of age. I'll be 40 in July next month. And that is a piece of my culture, right? The generation that I'm a part of. I am someone who, even though I was born in New York, I was raised in the South, in Texas to be exact. That is a piece of my culture. I often say I'm a bit of a unicorn because I'm also a third generation Lutheran. And so that is a part of my culture, my religious identity. And then we go into other details about who I am in terms of my socioeconomic class, my educational attainment. I am a graduate of what is now known as United Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. And all of these things, all of these experiences are a part of my cultural makeup. Right? My background in undergrad was sociology. So this conversation around cultural competency is something that is core to who I am. It's how I think and show up in the world. And so I just identified parts and pieces of my cultural identity. And each of these aspects of who I am brings to bear different things, right? And all of those things come together to form my lived experience and to also form how I show up in the world, right? So that's culture. And so I want you to be thinking about what are the aspects of your culture, how you define yourself. Culture is defined as the norms, the rituals, the behaviors, the beliefs, the languages that make up who you are, right? So that's culture. Now, competency is an interesting word because competency for me, right, brings to mind what does it mean to actually be skilled in something, to be competent, if you will, to have the capacity to engage something, right? So I am a competent speaker, or I am a competent coach. I am skilled in those ways of being. And so I invite you to consider, what are the things that you would say you are competent in? And I want you to think about that both as an individual. I want you to think about that as a member of a congregation, the communities that you're a part of. And I want you to also think about that as someone who is a part of this larger body of faith known as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, right? What are those competencies that each of those communities have and come to bear in your day-to-day being? Now, here comes the important part. Here comes the problematizing of this. Cultural competency tends to reside in our intellect. When we think about our skills, when we think about our capacity for doing things, when we think about those things that make us competent, it's often a head thing. It's an intellectual endeavor. And as people of the Lutheran Church, we know something about residing in our minds and in our intellect. As people who are of Western culture, right, intellect is also something that we understand something about. So when we think about cultural and competency or cultural competence, it's about the ability to have skills, ways of being, values that allow us to engage culture, people of other cultures, spaces and places that might be different from our own, and our own cultural understanding in a particular way. Now, I didn't ask Bishop Ortiz to do this or about this, but I'd like to suggest, instead of using the phrase competency, what if we thought about cultural embodiment, right? Cultural embodiment rather than competency. And here's why I'd like to suggest this. Again, we are people that understand or that think our way through so many things. And as we think about issues of race, as we think about issues of gender and class and identity and orientation, right, we have spent a lot of time building awareness. I can't tell you how many people I know have been reading books, especially since last year and the murder of George Floyd. There are book clubs, there are invitations to dialogue, there's invitations to journey together in different communities as people are learning and thinking about these things that have been a big piece, right, of beginning to understand who we are and how we be in the world. But when we think about embodiment, right? Embodiment is about the way we be, about the way that we live out, about the way that our values are rooted in our personhood, in our being. So I'm less interested in people becoming competent, right? Skilled in this way of learning about, talking about, engaging culture. I'm more interested in people actually embodying, living, breathing, doing, being, right? In a way that is not just inclusive, not just accepting, not just open, but in a way that actually reflects a rootedness and an understanding in who we are as individuals and leans into who we are collectively and who the other is. So when we think about cultural embodiment, then for me, that means that we have to do some rooting. We have to do some digging into who we are. Because when we only look at what we're learning as it relates to the other, how we engage the other, who the other is, how we connect with the other becomes almost an object, right, of our view. The other becomes the thing to be studied, right? The person, the community, the place to be studied. And we're not about objectifying. We're about embodying our beliefs and our values, and then ultimately respecting the humanity of another. So I'd like us to imagine what it would be to shift our mindset from simply becoming competent to becoming people who are embodied in their cultural understanding and whose embodiment then leads them to respect, to lean into, to engage with the embodiment of others. One of the people that I have been engaging the most around this conversation is Resmaa Menakem. He is the author of My Grandmother's Hands. He is a racial justice educator. He is someone that works in the field of cultural competency and somatics, okay? And Resmaa Menakem invites us to think about something. He invites us to say that it's not about white supremacy, if you will. It's about white bodies and bodies of culture, and that these two bodies have experienced life, have experienced ways of being in very different realities. These realities have informed how people show up in ways that actually impact the bodies that they're in. And so embodiment, on the one hand, invites us to then recognize who we are in our bodies and who others are in their bodies, and then how we create new ways of being together. But it begins with, first and foremost, the humanization of ourselves and of the other. Many times in the Lutheran Church, we spend a lot of time reflecting on either what's wrong with us, or how we are invited to be different, or how we are invited to include the other in our midst. What cultural embodiment leads me to reflect on is that it's not about the reality of the knowledge that we have. It's about the reality of how it is that we deeply root in our bodies and understanding who and whose we are, so that we can then respect the other. So I want you to take a moment to just reflect on your body, to reflect on the body that God created you in, to reflect on the bodies that are in the community that you call your community of faith. What is it about these bodies that you notice? What is it about your body that you have questions about? What is it about your body that you have struggled to accept, right? Because before we start to engage another's body, we have to actually engage our bodies. And taking it a step further, as we really reflect on the bodies that we're in, then we also start to understand the cultural ways of being that our bodies have brought to bear, right? So what are the practices, the norms, the values, the behaviors that then inform how your body shows up in the world? One of the greatest lies is that white culture writ large doesn't have a culture, doesn't have ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of understanding. But we know the reality that white bodies do, right? And in our denomination, in the communities of faith that we're a part of, we see elements of that culture come to bear. And so the first step is to really start to understand your body, the body that you inhabit, before we turn our gaze to another body, before we turn our gaze to another culture. And it's not that we turn in on ourselves, like in the words of Luther, not that we're incurvatus in se, not that we're so focused and navel gazing that we're not able to see another. It's that we root ourselves in our bodies in order to understand who God created us to be, to understand our gifts and graces, and to understand what are the things that have happened within the societies that we find ourselves in that have impacted how we view ourselves and how we ultimately view the other. Once we root and ground in that way, our embodiment, our way of being, then leads us to look at another in a very different way. The other doesn't become, again, the object of scrutiny. The other becomes one who is also embodied, one who bears the image of the divine, one who is a part of humanity. And we are then invited to reflect on their embodiment, their lived experience, their body of culture. And as we do that, we then enter into a relationship, right? We enter into ways of being and knowing that really do lead us to understand one another beyond skills, beyond thinking, beyond intellect, and even beyond feelings. One of the moves that we've seen recently in the conversations around race and gender and class is about proximity, and how proximity, when I'm in relationship to someone, then that would change my mind and change my way of being in the world. I can tell you right now that as someone who is from Texas and who loves her state very much and who has diverse relationships with people of all backgrounds, that proximity does not necessarily change the way that we behave, right? Proximity is, I think, important, as is awareness, but I think the missing piece of the conversation is this third leg, if you will, this leg of embodiment. Proximity cannot do what embodiment can do. Proximity just gets us closer, right? It has us maybe leaning up against each other, living in connection with each other, but it doesn't actually help us to fully value the humanity of another and to actually recognize the bodies of another. So we have awareness, which is the intellect piece, which I think a lot of times we think about when we think about the term competency. We have proximity, which is the relational piece, right? How are we actually connected to communities and cultures and people who are different than us? And then we have embodiment, right? And I like to think of these three things in three particular ways of our being, our beliefs, and our behaviors. And so the goal of cultural competency or cultural embodiment, if you will, is to come into alignment so that the beliefs that we profess as people of faith, we believe in a God who has created all of creation, all of humanity in God's very own image. So our beliefs undergird this work, right? Our being, right, gets us in touch with who God created us to be, as good, as holy, as sacred, as gifted, regardless of what your body looks like, of how your body functions, of the various capacities of your body. It is good. And then our behaviors flow out of who we understand ourselves to be and flow out of our beliefs. And that's the goal of this work. That is the goal of this invitation, of this focus on cultural competency or cultural embodiment. It is to actually align our being with our beliefs and ultimately be and behave differently in the world. So, when we think about this as it relates to who you are as people of faith, lay leaders, rostered leaders, young people, when we think about who this as it relates to your communities, the question becomes, how are you practicing ways of being that take into account your culture, right? What are the beliefs that you have that flow out of your faith, that flow out of your communities of formation around culture, around bodies, around ways of being? And then what are the behaviors that you in particular as an individual and as a community are being called to embody for such a time as this? So one of the things that this leads me to is thinking about the very reason why I'm Christian. I've said this in a variety of spaces, but I am honestly simply Christian because of the incarnation, because of God's desire to be in bodily form with his beloved, with God's beloved humanity. Right? So on the one hand, you could talk about God as being competent in the earlier scriptures of our faith, right? God having an awareness and God thinking about being in relationship with God's own creation. But as we see the story unfold, we see that there seems to be a missing piece as God is telling God's people how to be in the world, as God is inviting God's people into new ways of being and believing and behaving. There becomes some struggles. There are some issues. It seems like we just don't quite get it, right? And there seems to come a time when God recognizes that the best way to learn from, to live with, and to love the very creation that was formed out of dust, the very creation that was breathed life into, is to actually be with us in human form, in bodily form, right? So God actually embodies God's self, God embodies God's values, God embodies God's beliefs in the person of Jesus the Christ. So embodiment in and of itself is not a new form. It's not a new concept. It's not a new way of being. For us as people of Christian faith, we are integrally connected to embodiment because we believe in a God that took on flesh, that took on all of the things that make us human, to be in relationship with us and to model new ways of being, believing, and ultimately behaving. So as we pull this together, right? I really want you to consider, when you think about cultural competency, when you think about what does it mean to be in relationship with people who are different from you, to first and foremost recognize, right, that you are a person that has culture, that your body holds the realities of the culture that you are a part of, that you were formed by, right? And if you aren't able to identify those cultural aspects, I want you to then take a step back, just ask yourself, what is it about our society that has basically said that you don't have culture, right? And how do you start to really pick apart the norms, the languages, the customs, the ways of being that are unique to your culture? And then I want you to spend some time reflecting on the awareness, the proximity, and the embodiment that would actually lead you deeper into the very work that we say we want to do, right? Which is to ultimately be in relationships for the sake of the kingdom of God, to be in relationships that are life-giving and justice-seeking, and ultimately reflect God's vision of a beloved community. And I want you to take some time to reflect on your faith, this faith that comes to life, that is enfleshed in the person, the being, the body of Jesus the Christ, right? So the invitation is for you to shift from thinking about becoming competent, from you to shift from thinking about the skills that you need to learn, for you to shift into your body, for you to drop into the being that God formed you as, and for you to make amends with your body. I think one of the things that we struggle with, especially within white body culture, is huge amounts of guilt or shame, right? Guilt or shame for our past and our history, guilt or shame for maybe ways of being or believing or behaving that were enacted before a new awareness was received, guilt or shame for feeling helpless or hopeless about all of the stuff, right, that we really are struggling with figuring out in this time that we find ourselves in. And I don't find guilt or shame to be that helpful, right? I believe that we are called to be people of repentance when we actually say the thing, when we recognize the thing that we have done, the ways that we have fallen short, and we commit to turning away. I think we're called to be people of reparation, right? How we actually do the things that enact change, that correct the wrongs of the past. And then we become people who are living into reconciliation and who are actually living out this new creation, right? So instead of cultural competency, I invite you to reflect on cultural embodiment. And for those who are interested in more conversation about this, I'm excited to join you for your lunch breakout, where we'll do some conversations and reflections on your community, on your culture, and then on practices that you can start to engage that help you root more fully and firmly into your being for the sake of rooting and understanding and leaning into relationship with others. The last thing I would say is this, right? Why is this important? Why is it important for us to be people who engage the work of cultural competency or cultural embodiment? Why are you even interested in this conversation? If it's fear that leads you to the conversation, I invite you to reflect on that, right? And I say fear from the standpoint of, if we don't change, we will die. Or if we don't invite folks in of different cultures and spaces and places, then we will not be able to persist. And if fear is what's guiding you, then I really invite you to take a step back and reflect on, what would it take for you to lean into something that is more life-giving, something that is uplifting and empowering as it relates to your engagement, right? And that which is uplifting and empowerment is the promise that God has given us all, that God would never both leave nor forsake us, and that God's very image is rooted deeply and implanted deeply in each one of us. So for me, the reason that I engage in this work, the reason that I am so passionate about coaching around issues of race and racial healing and wellness and culture, is because I honestly believe that we miss out on an aspect of the divine. We miss out on an aspect of the image of God when we are not in relationship, not only with ourselves, but with others. So I look forward to joining you all in conversation over lunch as we more deeply go into this concept around cultural embodiment and a shift from competency to embodied ways of being, and as we explore some practices that will help us actually take on this new way of being. Thank you so much.
Rozella, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Rozella, for everything that you have shared with us this morning. This is part, you've all witnessed part of our friendship. She changes things up on me all the time. God bless her. God bless her. And thank you. Thank you for the invitation. One thing that I kind of messed up on is that earlier when we started talking about the themes, I should have invited you to have a notebook and pen with you. Dr. Bonfiglio yesterday, last night, Rozella today, this afternoon will be with Pastor Vanderveer. You need to be taking notes. I know that we're wanting to shift from a place of competency into embodiment. And yet I do believe that there is an element to kind of sitting with the language that can lead to an embodiment that actually leads towards justice. So Rozella, thank you as always for the wisdom that you shared with us. And hopefully we have plenty of people who have signed up to be in your breakout session. And I can't wait to hear what those conversations will be like. So thank you again, Rozella, for being with us and for staying with us during our lunchtime. Now I will